Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 6. In the previous episode, we began our investigation into the sausage-making process of historicity by first emphasizing the fact that when it comes to any historical work, it was important to remember that it's all cooked sausage, and that as such, there were at least three major areas of concern within this sausage-making factory or process that were worth looking into. So let's refer to each of them once more. We have already covered the first major area of concern, which consisted in our discussion of the decisive and pivotal role of historians and all the various ways in which these historians weigh in and put their thumb on the historical authenticity scale within this sausage-making process. We will now look into the second major area of concern, which we have entitled The Picturesque Nature of Historical Narratives, which will be followed up by the third and remaining major concern, which we are referring to as the 4 R's of historical authenticity. Let's turn now to the picturesque nature of historical narratives. In this episode, we are going to make a noticeable shift in our approach to understanding historicity by introducing history and historical narratives in a more picturesque style, wherein the historian, knowingly or unknowingly, is engaged in the ongoing pursuit of clarity and historical visibility through the words which he or she uses in depicting these historical events or characters. In this sense, the historical narrative is constantly and somewhat necessarily in an ongoing tug-of-war with historical authenticity. In other words, the more an historical narrative attempts to bring clarity and visibility by figuratively portraying a mental image or historical portrait for its audience, the more it is in danger of diminishing its historical authenticity. And while this is a risk worth taking, it is also a major concern for those historians who are well aware of the tension between truth-telling and storytelling in this ongoing pursuit of historical authenticity. And while I find the picturesque nature of historical narratives to be very helpful in bringing clarity and historical visibility to past historical events and characters, I am also well aware of the dangers associated with such an approach, in which are couched in the words, "A picture is worth 1,000 words." Clearly, a picture is worth 1,000 words. For example, here we have an artist portraying what is clearly meant to be a dramatic and inspiring portrait of his or her own interpretation of a biblical prophet in communication with and in awe of God, bringing mental clarity and historical visibility to an historical narrative they have read and to what would otherwise be left to the imaginations of 1,001 other readers and to 1,001 other interpretations. Which brings us to the next point, and that is that while it is true that a picture is worth 1,000 words, it is equally true that a word is worth 1,000 pictures. After all, how many mental images can be formed and how many portraits can be painted, giving mental clarity and historical visibility to this single word, prophet, that we have here before you? Well, if a picture is worth 1,000 words and a word is worth 1,000 pictures, then when you combine them together, as we often do in historical works, then we have 1,000 thousands, or what amounts to 1,000,000 different ways of understanding a single word when coupled with the possibility of 1,000 artistic interpretations or historical portraits, such as we have here with but one artist's portrayal of what it means to be a prophet. There is, however, so much more going on here that it is important that we take notice of it, or we will completely miss a major part of what goes on in the sausage-making process of creating an historical narrative. For example, consider the first vision and the numerous attempts by historians and artists to portray this historic event, first as an historical narrative and then as an historical portrait. The historian begins then with historical facts, and these historical facts eventually give rise to an historical narrative. This historical narrative then gives inspiration to various artists, and the results are a great variety of historical portraits. What is forgotten in all of this, however, are the various inferences, theories, and judgments that both the historian and the artist are incorporating into this entire sausage-making process, and which the consumer is entirely unaware of when he or she sits down to enjoy this or that historical narrative or portrait, which has now become what we have referred to as cooked sausage. Let's take a moment then to examine this process a bit closer. When it comes to an historical narrative and portrait, one cannot simply come up with a likely story or a fantastic or otherwise implausible portrait. It must be a credible story and a believable portrait. And yet, what is often missed by the consumer is that this credible story and believable portrait is dependent upon a number of interconnected elements. So let's lay them out, beginning with the historical facts. Next comes inferences, which are drawn from these historical facts. Then theories are developed from the various inferences. This is followed by the numerous moral and aesthetic judgments which are often made. Finally, all of these elements, facts, inferences, theories, and judgments, go into the creation of an historical narrative and the painting of an historical portrait. In fact, we like to refer to these various elements as the historian's artistic brushstrokes as shown here. Even though the historical portrait requires a great deal of artistry on the part of the historian and the artist, it is important to remember that it is the historical facts, the research, documentation, footnotes, and original sources that make this historical work a work of nonfiction rather than fiction, and makes a portrait an historical portrait rather than mere fantasy. Again, the skills of fact-finding, the morality of truth-telling, and the artistry of storytelling, coupled with the inferences drawn, the theories developed, and the judgments made, are all part and parcel of understanding historicity and this sausage-making process. Given all these variables, then, it should not surprise us when things not only go wrong, but go terribly wrong, as we shall now show. A good example of what can not only go wrong, but terribly wrong, when it comes to historical research, were the infamous Mark Hoffman bombings and forgeries. In the early 1980s, Mark Hoffman had forged a significant number of historical documents in an ongoing effort to deceive and sell these documents to interested parties, including the church. In effect, Hoffman forged the documents and faked the narrative, and all of this was done in the name of historical research. The forgeries eventually led to the bombings as part of a cover-up. The lesson learned is that not all historical research is legitimate, and that historical facts can be forged, faked, or otherwise manipulated to support a bogus and controversial narrative. It is an attempt to rewrite history for whatever nefarious reason, while relying upon the credibility of past historians to give cover to one's own phony historical research. Notice, by the way, that both the fact-finding skills of historical research and the artistic skills of forging documents were both present in this nefarious undertaking. In any case, this one notorious event alone should serve as a warning to us all that historical research, documentation, footnotes, and original sources are not to be taken simply at face value, or worse, to be worshipped as a false idol or golden calf of historical authenticity. For one is left to wonder how many other forged documents remain out there, and which are currently presented as authentic and original source material for historical research. One must never forget that the pursuit of historical authenticity is dependent upon all five of these elements: facts, inferences, theories, and judgments, all culminating in a narrative which itself must be backed up by historical research, documentation, original sources, and a great many footnotes, all of which must never be simply taken at face value, as was alluded to in the Hoffman case previously noted. And while the facts might remain the same, the inferences, theories, judgments, and the eventual narratives and portraits will vary from historian to historian and from artist to artist. This means that each historian, like each artist, has his or her own literary or artistic style, and no two historians or artists will present an historical narrative or paint an historical portrait quite the same. Fawn M. Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, is a different historical narrative or imaginative portrait of the life of the prophet Joseph Smith, in many respects, than is Richard Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, even though their historical research and literary narratives relied upon much of the same historical facts and documentation available in our day. The point is that as more historical research takes place, even more historical facts will be unearthed or gathered in, and new inferences, new theories, and new judgments will be made, all leading to new historical narratives, outdating and overriding the old narratives or portraits. In short, historical authenticity is a moving target with a more or less degree of authenticity, ultimately dependent upon the bedrock adherence to the historical facts available at the time, leaving the complete story or full story forever untold. In other words, historical narratives and imaginative portraits are always an approximation of an historical count or landscape, and there will never be written or artistically portrayed in our day or in any day the definitive biography of the life of Joseph Smith or of the early origins of the church by any mortal historian or artist, now or ever. The prophet Joseph Smith himself made this point when he stated that no man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. I don't blame anyone for not believing my history. If I had not experienced what I have, I would not have believed it myself. This doesn't mean that we abandon historicity as a lost cause, but rather that we approach it with the due caution and with the appropriate buyer beware warning, and not with the reverence reserved for sacred documents or religious beliefs. It is because of all the various elements involved in an historical work that we have colored historicity in a more artistic manner, and as a reminder to all of us of the numerous ways or different stages in the sausage-making process wherein historicity as an academic discipline can go wrong. And so, by emphasizing the picturesque nature of historical narratives, it will allow us to gain a better understanding of Mormon and post-Mormon historicity, and this false alternative Latter-day Saints are being pressured into, that is, between blissful ignorance of their own history or a full-fledged faith crisis. We have already shown in previous episodes as to why this is a false alternative, but now we are in a position to use this artistic approach to historicity to make a number of helpful observations about these earlier episodes. Let's start here by showing a photograph of the world-renowned and contemporary artist Leonid Afremov and one of his most popular oil paintings entitled Alley by the Lake. Our purpose for showing this is to help you make and retain the mental connection between historians as artists as well as historical works with the painting of an historical portrait or landscape. In fact, we will be using this particular oil painting throughout the remainder of this episode. At the end of the day, what we are trying to achieve is a Mormon historicity, which is as authentic and complete an historical portrait or landscape as is possible, given the limitations of historical research and our ability to tell a credible story. The completed portrait, however, is always an ongoing fact-finding, truth-telling, and storytelling project, which is subject to change based on the acquisition of new facts, as well as the new inferences, new theories, and new judgments which are made. and which all go together to make up these historical narratives or portraits. This is why we consider these various elements or aspects of historicity as the colorful brushstrokes of the historian. And although these elements are not normally recognized nor formally acknowledged, they are those elements which give artistic and personal expression to this or that historical work or portrait. Potentially, there is a completed historical portrait or landscape to be painted, even though no historian will ever be capable of presenting this completed story as a finished work, as it is always an ongoing project. Nonetheless, and despite the obstacles standing in their way, historians are comforted in the fact that beneath this ideal or finished historical portrait of the past, there exists a vast historical landscape of data points and puzzle pieces yet to be fully connected or properly assembled. This means that an historian is not only working on the solid ground of historical facts, but is always working within an established historical landscape made up of a multitude of historical data points which are predetermined and not subject to change. Nevertheless, while the underlying historical facts do not change, the inferences, theories, and judgments that make up the current narrative are always subject to change, and that accounts for the great variety of historical narratives and imaginative portraits that we see in the marketplace. Another way of thinking of this is that unlike fictional works, where the author is free to color outside the lines, non-fictional works are more of a paint-by-numbers discipline, wherein the historian must color within the lines of this predetermined historical landscape and historical data points. Non-fictional works, then, are a paint-by-numbers discipline, while fictional works are those works wherein the author is free to color outside the lines, unrestrained by any predetermined historical landscape or historical data points as shown here. We need to always keep in mind, then, that hidden beneath an historical narrative or portrait is an historical landscape of data points and puzzle pieces that are part of a much larger historical landscape and a never-to-be-fully finished historical work. Mormon and post-Mormon historicity, then, are also embedded on an historical landscape of data points and puzzle pieces. So let's use this understanding and apply it to the blue pilling and red pilling of Mormon apologist and post-Mormon antagonist spoken of in earlier episodes. Mormon apologists, like any good historian, must have data points made up of verifiable facts. The fact that they are often selective data points taken from the currently available landscape does not debunk the fact that they still exist and are still part of the overall landscape. Mormon apologists are often portrayed as exemplifying the blue pill narrative, wherein the members of the church are kept in blissful ignorance, and yet the data points beneath this faith-promoting narrative are also part of the historical landscape and are rightly a part of Mormon historicity. Post-Mormon antagonists must also have data points made up of verifiable facts. The fact that they too are often selective data points taken from the currently available landscape also does not debunk the fact that they still exist and are still part of the overall landscape. Post-Mormon antagonists are proudly portrayed as exemplifying the red pill narrative, wherein the members of the church are presented with a faith-pouncing narrative leading to a faith crisis. And yet, the data points beneath this faith-pouncing narrative are also part of the historical landscape and are rightly a part of Mormon historicity. It is true that Mormon apologists construct or paint a faith-promoting narrative. A Mormon historicity that is tied to selective data points that are part of the historical landscape and which is portrayed as a light, glorious, and inspiring portrait. It is no wonder, then, that church leaders encourage members to ignore all the negativity on the internet and carry on. It is also true that post-Mormon antagonists construct a faith-pouncing narrative, a post-Mormon historicity that is also tied to selective data points that are part of the historical landscape and which is portrayed as a dark, dreary, and damning portrait. It is no wonder, then, that post-Mormon antagonists encourage active members of the church to wake up to their true history, a post-Mormon historicity that leads directly to a faith crisis. That both narratives, with their selective data points and puzzle pieces, are part of the same overall historical landscape seems to be missed or passed over by both sides. And yet, like it or not, both sets of data points exist, even though the inferences, theories, and judgments drawn from those data points are furiously debated. In order to gain a better appreciation of how these two opposing and powerful narratives came to be constructed, we are going to take up an example of both Mormon and post-Mormon historicity in order to show you how the historical facts selected, the inferences drawn, and the theories developed resulted in their opposing faith-promoting or faith-pouncing narratives. The fact that we end up with both a faith-promoting and a faith-pouncing narrative from the exact same historical landscape should alert us to the fact that we are not always dealing with the same data points, but with two sets of selected data points which are obviously designed to support this or that narrative. Let's begin first with the red-pilled post-Mormon narrative, and then turn to the blue-pilled Mormon narrative as a counterweight. In this example, our post-Mormon antagonist begins with two data points or historical facts taken from the historical landscape of Mormon historicity. We refer to these two historical facts as follows. Treasure hunting with a seer stone. Joseph Smith was incriminated as a money digger. Translating with a seer stone. Joseph Smith used the same treasure hunting seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon by placing the seer stone in the darkness of a hat in order, he claims, to see the illuminated and revealed text more clearly. An inference is then drawn from the above two facts. If the treasure hunting with a seer stone is a fraudulent hoax, then likewise would be the translation of the Book of Mormon by the same means. From these facts and this inference, a theory is developed as follows. Joseph Smith was a poor and desperate treasure hunter looking to make a quick buck, and the Golden Bible hoax was just more of the same. Based on these facts, inferences, and theory, several judgments are made. For instance, because Joseph Smith was caught up in treasure hunting and translating by means of a seer stone, he is obviously a charlatan, and the Book of Mormon is just as obviously a fictional hoax and money-making fraud. Finally, a portrait is painted in such a way that all the above facts, inferences, theories, and judgments are weaved into a faith-pouncing narrative showing Joseph Smith to be a charlatan, the Book of Mormon a fraud, and the Mormon Church untrue. This, of course, is the dark, dreary, and damning portrait that leads to a faith crisis. In this example, our Mormon apologist also begins with two data points or historical facts, taken from the historical landscape of Mormon historicity. We refer to these two historical facts as follows. Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon. Completely translated in 74 working days, without any notes, books, or manuscripts before him. Book of Mormon complexities. Over 1,000 Hebrew literary elements. 367 chiasmus, 3 calendar systems, efficient system of weights and measures, embedded flashbacks, etc. An inference is then drawn from the above two facts. The Book of Mormon complexities cannot be naturally accounted for when given a 74 working day translation period. Something else was going on. From these facts and this inference, a theory is developed as follows. The only way to account for the literary complexities of the Book of Mormon being produced in such a short translation time period is to accept Joseph Smith's story of divine intervention as true. Based on these facts, inferences, and theory, several judgments are made. For instance, Joseph Smith was not a charlatan but a prophet of God, and the Book of Mormon is not a fraud but the inspired Word of God. Finally, a portrait is painted in such a way that all of the above facts, inferences, theories, and judgments are portrayed in a faith-promoting narrative showing Joseph Smith to be a prophet of God, the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God, and the Mormon Church to be true. This, of course, is the light, glorious, and inspiring portrait that encourages members of the faith to carry on. Having given examples of these two opposing and powerful historical narratives, let us spend a moment on the all too often contentious and gotcha business of what we call the debunking of narratives, wherein both Mormon apologists and post-Mormon antagonists argue past one another while claiming to have debunked the historical narrative of each other, with post-Mormon antagonists claiming to have debunked Mormon historicity and Mormon apologists claiming to have debunked post-Mormon historicity. Instead of understanding that both Mormon and post-Mormon historicity is embedded on the same historical landscape of data points and puzzle pieces, the two opposing sides set out to debunk the authenticity of each other's narratives, forgetting that even if Mormon apologists successfully debunk the red pill post-Mormon historical narrative, that the historical facts or data points still remain and must be dealt with. And likewise, even if post-Mormon antagonists were able to successfully debunk the blue pill Mormon historical narrative, that the historical facts or data points would also remain in play and must be explained. The point is that even if both the Mormon and the post-Mormon historical narratives are debunked, nevertheless, whatever historical facts or data points that underlie those narratives still remain in play as part of Mormon historicity's historical landscape. Again, historical authenticity demands the incorporation of all the facts or data points currently available, which means refusing to ignore or deny the inconvenient truths or data points that dot the landscape, regardless of which narrative they support. Let us give a quick synopsis of the material covered so far. First, what we are being faced with are two opposing and very powerful narratives, with Mormon historicity painting a light, glorious, and inspiring portrait, as against a post-Mormon historicity which paints a dark, dreary, and damning portrait. Secondly, we need to keep in mind that beneath each of these two opposing narratives or portraits are historical data points, which are what makes these opposing narratives so powerful. In other words, without the underlying historical data points, the narratives would not hold up under scrutiny. A third point to keep in mind is just how these historical portraits or opposing narratives came about in the first place. That is, by beginning with facts, the historical data points, and eventually culminating in a particular narrative. However, what is too often forgotten is that what stands between the facts and the narratives are the many inferences, theories, and judgments which are made and which color the facts in this or that way. Lastly, it must never be forgotten that these selective data points are all part of a much larger historical landscape that must be taken into account in our ongoing quest for historical authenticity. And this is why being pressured into choosing between one or the other of these two contrary historical narratives is such a false alternative, because in doing so, one is also rejecting the legitimate historical data points which underlie these various historical narratives. We can now turn to the last of our three major concerns in this sausage-making process of historicity, which we are referring to as the 4 R's of historical authenticity. It is true that historical authenticity begins with historical research, but our three concerns in this sausage-making process is not with the techniques and guidelines needed for effective historical research in the use of primary and secondary sources, but with the pursuit of historical authenticity once this historical research has been completed. And this is where the 4 R's of historical authenticity comes in. So let me list them in the order that we will be discussing them. First, retrace, as in retrace one's steps back to the bedrock data points. Second, reassess, as in reassess all the available data points and not just the supportive data points that one might be relying upon. Third, reconstruct, as in reconstruct a new narrative by incorporating all the new data points currently available. And fourth and final, repeat, as in repeat these 4 steps again and again. The 4 R's of historical authenticity represent, then, the steps to be taken by historians in their endless quest for the holy grail of historicity, which, you'll recall, is the complete or full story unadulterated. The fact that this finished historical portrait is the ideal, an ideal that will never be fully realized, does not take away from the importance or significance of this ongoing quest for historical authenticity, regardless of how daunting or never-ending the task may be. The first of the 4 R's is to retrace. This means that regardless of which narrative we adhere to, we need to retrace the steps back down to the bedrock data points upon which each of these narratives depend for their authenticity. That is, down to the historical facts upon which everything else rests. This also means setting aside for now all the inferences, theories, and judgments that gave rise to and support to one's particular narrative, and this, whether this narrative be a faith-promoting or a faith-pouncing narrative. The second of the 4 R's is to reassess the historical landscape, which means not just some, but all the data points available at the time, including paying attention to all the missing and necessary data points and connecting puzzle pieces that have not as yet been discovered or entertained. How do we know these missing and connecting data points and puzzle pieces exist? Because there is only one reality, one truth, one historical landscape, and only one Mormon historicity, not 2. So we know with certainty that these seemingly opposing data points are actually part of one and the same underlying historical landscape and are not part of 2 separate and distinct historical narratives that are at war with one another. The third of the 4 R's is to reconstruct a new historical narrative based on all the data points currently available, both pro and con. And even if this new narrative requires us to research and explore the missing data points and connecting puzzle pieces that we know are a part of the historical landscape, and which are required in order to make such a new and comprehensive narrative possible. This is not about telling both sides of the story, but it is about reconstructing a new narrative based on all the data points and puzzle pieces available, including the missing data points and connecting puzzle pieces that make such a new narrative possible. The point is that until these 2 opposing historical narratives are interwoven into one comprehensive and coherent portrait, historical authenticity will have eluded us, as neither the Mormon apologist nor the post-Mormon antagonist will be able to account for the legitimate data points of the other side. The fourth of the 4 R's is to repeat these 4 steps as new data points and connecting puzzle pieces arise, in an ongoing attempt to achieve an authentic historical portrait of the underlying landscape of Mormon historicity. This process repeats itself over and over again until the entire historical landscape has been painted over, revealing the entire portrait. Again, this finished portrait is the ideal, an ideal that will never be fully realized, but this completed portrait, or the full story unadulterated, nevertheless remains as the holy grail of historicity. With this finished portrait or landscape before us, we can now see why this false alternative wherein Latter-day Saints are being pressured into choosing between blissful ignorance or a faith crisis is so wrong-headed. Because what we are being asked to choose between are 2 puzzle pieces or segments of a much larger historical picture or story. What is obviously being overlooked when presented with this false alternative are all the missing data points and connecting puzzle pieces that would connect and make sense of these two seemingly diverse segments and complete the picture. If we could only remember that what lies beneath all the historical works that we are presented with and what lends them credibility is their adherence to a predetermined and much larger historical landscape full of missing data points and connecting puzzle pieces, keeping us from ever knowing the full story in a both pure and unadulterated state. We need to always keep in mind then that hidden beneath an historical narrative or portrait is an historical landscape of data points and puzzle pieces that are part of a much larger and never to be fully finished historical portrait. Nonetheless, it is the historian's strict adherence to this predetermined and much larger historical landscape that makes their historical work a work of nonfiction rather than fiction. In other words, historians must color within the lines, while fictional writers are free to color outside those lines. We have now covered all three major areas of concern in this sausage-making process of historicity, which consisted, first, in our discussion of the decisive and pivotal role of historians, and all the various ways in which these historians weigh in and put their thumb on the historical authenticity scale. And then we took up our discussion of the picturesque nature of historical narratives, which are colored not only by the historical facts that are gathered, but by all the inferences, theories, and judgments which are interposed by the historian into their historical narratives. And finally, we discussed what we referred to as the 4 R's of historical authenticity, wherein the steps were laid out to be taken by the historian, not before, but after the historical research has been completed, which were designed to both guide and assure the ongoing pursuit of historical authenticity in its quest for the holy grail of historicity, that is, the full and complete story in a pure and unadulterated state. There is much more that can be said about this sausage-making process of historicity, but this will have to do for the time being. As we end this episode, let us once again put a plug in for our course on eternalism by encouraging you to visit our website at christianeternalism.org. As Latter-day Saints and as exponents of eternalism, we are looking for and insisting upon historical authenticity and not conjectures in our discussion of Mormon and post-Mormon historicity. In this search for truth, be it of a scientific or historical nature, we must quickly learn to differentiate between facts and all the inferences, theories, judgments, and narratives that literally come after the fact. Elder Whitsoe puts the importance of making these distinctions this way, and I quote, "Facts are harmless enough, but the inferences drawn from them, sometimes true, often false, may involve serious consequences. The biggest questions before the modern world concern themselves with the inferences drawn from the recently accumulated body of truth. There can be no objection to inferences made in honesty and in search for truth, but it is most objectionable to give them an undue and improper prominence." Unquote. This observation is important, given the emphasis that we have put on facts, inferences, theories, judgments, and narratives in our understanding of Mormon historicity.